Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
And welcome to your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. So glad you're spending some of your busy weekend schedule with me. Can you believe that we are now at the end of the month of March? And we're getting ready to enter into the month of April. In my part of the world, the Northern Hemisphere, many parts of the country are just beginning to understand the meaning of the word spring, as the weather is changing from colder to milder and hopefully heading toward summer very soon. Other parts of the world that may be hearing the program, in the Southern Hemisphere, you're entering your autumn season, heading toward your winter time in the not-too-distant future. But here in the Northern Hemisphere, things are changing. Of course, we spend quite a bit of our time in Florida, so we don't see that dramatic of a weather change during the course of our time. It's basically summer and spring here in Florida year-round. Mostly summer, I might add. We have a home in Georgia that saw some snow this past winter, and some colder temperatures are still there occasionally at night. But we are in the time up there that I can see from the cameras that things are beginning to bud and change so quickly. And before long, it'll be springtime with all the beautiful flowers and everything in full bloom, and then summertime. And we'll be spending, hopefully, a lot of time in Georgia doing a lot of interesting and very important things in terms of work and ministry. It's not so much a vacation as it is a place to go to do some of the things that we are led and called to do. So let's get started on today's program, and let me kind of give you some of the thoughts that are running in the back of my mind today as we start your weekend show. I have been, as many of you who are regular listeners know, I got my start in radio back around 1970. And it dawns on me how many years that actually is. 1970 to today. You know, we're approaching, 49 years of being involved in some facet of radio. And I'm thinking to myself, where in the world has the time gone? Where in the world has the time gone? By 1972, I was pretty much full-time during parts of the year in the radio business. And by the mid-1970s, still acting as a disc jockey, it was my full-time job for a very long time. And as many of you know, engineering is something that always was of interest to me in terms of the radio business. Electronics had been my hobby as a child and through my teenage years. And I realized, I felt even in the 1970s, there was going to be some kind of changes happening in the broadcast industry. I couldn't put my finger on it. Nobody could have believed what was going to happen in the next, 15, 16, 17 years to the radio industry as we knew it. But something just said to get into the engineering side and don't be as concerned about being on the air. After all, I had seen, and I've shared this on other programs, and you may remember, I've met a lot of people that have tried to just make their living being a radio announcer. Some have been successful, but most are not. They end up having to do something else or change careers, or they always kind of live on the edge because, let's face it, even back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there were only so many high-paying radio announcer jobs and about 10 to 20 times the number of people wanting those jobs. So essentially, only the best of the best could ever get to those really big radio stations. One of my good friends, he's got about 10 years on me in terms of age. He made his living in the 60s, starting in 1960, like I started in 1970. as a radio announcer, and he has one of the most beautiful God-given voices you have ever heard. If you listen to the beginning of this program where you hear this, "It's Your Weekend Show," that's his voice. Good friend of mine, Jim Davis. He lives also in Florida these days, but he spent a career working up and down the dial, and like many in this business, lived in a lot of cities, a lot of towns, and had a remarkable career. He got in the business at a time where you could really rely on your voice to get you through those disc jockeys of the late 50s into the 60s, 70s. And it all began to change as we got into the 80s and headed toward the 90s. And there's where Jim was very smart. Jim worked his way toward management, not so much being on the air, though he could. And he understood the business, and he had made so many good connections. He survived a lot of the changes that were to come in the radio business. And as you can guess today, we are kind of talking about radio. And I'm also going to be talking about some of my opinions about the state of radio today, especially in the Western world, the United States and Canada in particular, where the technology future is, where it's not going, some of the opinions that are out there. I'm going to give you my opinion, and it's based on all the years that I've been in the business observing. I've heard a lot of things over the years, and some of those things have just not panned out like people predicted. But getting back to what I'm saying about people like a Jim Davis, they were able to make their career as a radio announcer, work their way toward management, and were able to slide into retirement under the bell before a lot of the corporate radio mess of today became the issue that it is today. A lot of people don't understand this, but radio has changed a lot since I started out. It used to be back, let's say 1970, 72, a company or an individual or whatever could only own so many radio stations, and I think it was like 10 AM and 10 FM stations. And they couldn't be in the same city except the AM and FM. You could own an AM and an FM radio station, let's say in a town like, I'm just thinking about it, Elmira, New York, or Stanton, Virginia, or Toccoa, Georgia. You could own an AM and FM, but you couldn't own another AM or FM that would have overlapping coverage to the other station. And you only could own 10 AM and 10 FM. In other words, you couldn't come into a town and buy up every radio station, and you couldn't own a newspaper and all this kind of stuff. In other words, there was a bit of diversity in the number of people that owned radio stations. But starting in the 1990s, it all started to change, and those numbers started to go up where you could own a lot more. And then you could own more than one AM or more than one FM in the same town. And by 1996... and a lot of people don't realize that 1996 was the big watershed year. A number of things started to happen. In terms of ownership, you could own almost this unlimited number. As long as you didn't have more than 51% of the market or some number like that, and it's changed a little bit since then, you could come to town and buy up more than half of the radio stations and put them under one roof. Technology had been changing significantly, and I started seeing this way back in the 1980s. We already had what's called analog automation, and so we could use tape machines and everything else to not have to have a live announcer for some of the programming. And a lot of beautiful music stations did that in the 60s and 70s, using an automated system to run their programming. Especially if they had an AM station in the building with live announcers, they could have the two formats. But getting back to what I'm trying to say, technology began to make some major headway in the radio business. And I was beginning to see what's called digital audio on computers, where you could edit. And then they started thinking about ways to operate radio stations with in and out devices. And I'm not going to get into the complexity, but before long, the computer was beginning to become the way to operate a radio station without a live person in the building. For years, you had to have somebody on duty at the radio station whenever you were on the air at what's called a control point. Now, that could be the radio announcer, it could be an engineer, or a combination of both, depending upon your station and circumstance. But they began to allow unattended operation when we put certain automated equipment in to watch the parameters of your station, to notify personnel and take it off if something was not working correctly. And I was very involved with that in the 1990s, pushing that ability, especially for non-commercial stations that are running, let's say, an educational network. We don't need to have somebody at every building. When the programming was coming in by satellite from the live announcer in one location, and it just seems silly to have to pay people to do nothing but sit inside of a building. And it made it an expensive operation for some of the non-commercial operators, and that's why many did not want to build stations or operate stations overnight. And let me go ahead and add something else to this. It was also good for many radio stations, especially in the 1990s. As the industry has changed, there's so much competition for what little advertising revenue is available, especially in the United States and Canada, for a local radio station, that you have to find a way to make it possible to keep on the air without going, into the red financially. If you're in a smaller town, there's not a whole lot of advertising revenue. And I've had people that will ask me, well, doesn't the government subsidize? No, they don't. If you're a private radio operator, there is no free check coming in the mail. It is strictly the advertising revenue you can generate that keeps you on the air. And when the economy is tight, a lot of places, are not able to afford to advertise, even though they should, especially when the times are tough. But without that advertising revenue, the station can't operate. The power bill, the music licensing fees, all these things come in each and every month. There's an FCC fee you got to pay every year. You pay the government does not pay you. And so as more competition has come in the marketplace to get advertising revenue, a lot of small radio stations don't make as much as they did 10, 20 years ago. And so, of course, they have to keep expenses down. Another thing that has happened is I was talking about the corporate radio monsters that have come into the business. Companies like Clear Channel, now known as iHeartRadio or Cumulus and others that all teeter on the verge of bankruptcy, they've come in and bought thousands upon thousands of radio stations in cities. Like if you're listening, for example, in the upstate of South Carolina, we're on a station up there. A lot of the radio stations out of Greenville, South Carolina, are owned by one or two companies. It's not 8 or 9 companies. It's just a handful right now. And they haven't done much good for the industry. And while there is advantages to having computers do certain kinds of programmings and certain things and certain ways to automate, a lot of radio stations have gone to this very simple formula of they put in a live morning show, and they always have some guy and girl on the air, and all they do is seem to giggle and, just act funny. And they try to act like they know what's going on in the pop culture world. And then the rest of the day is the computer. You don't realize it, but there may be somebody in another town 500 miles away that took 15 minutes to record a few things to say to make it sound like he's kind of live at the radio station, but he doesn't even live anywhere near that town. Yeah, some of those things are efficient in helping keep the cost down, but some of the big companies have used them so heavily they've kind of taken the heart and soul of what radio was and have just gotten rid of it. Now, I don't think I'm against technology in what I'm about to say here, because I use it in radio in some of my other work every day. I get it. In the 1960s, and when I started on the air in the 1970s, pretty much most radio stations had a live announcer on the air anytime they, as a station, were on the air. You had a guy that came in and did the morning show, somebody in the midday, the afternoon, the evening, and some stations that stayed on the air overnight. They had a live overnight announcer that could take your request. And radio back in those days was very much a one-on-one medium. That's how radio, it's one of the great things about radio as I got in the business. And some of the old-timers like myself, that like to talk about how radio used to be, yeah, I have some nostalgic memories of how radio was in the 1970s when you actually played a record, not a CD, an actual 45 RPM or maybe even occasionally a record album on the air. You had tape machines, you had networks like ABC, NBC, and Mutual and others for your news on the top of the hour, maybe a state network, depending where you were at. And it was a lot of work to do a decent radio show to get all those records played, all the commercials and all the jingles and everything you had to do. And the responsibilities, there was a lot of work. And if you did a 3 or 4 hour radio shift, you felt like you worked an 8-hour day. You may not believe it, but truly you did. Mentally and even to a degree in some places, physically, it was not an easy job. And so we can talk about the good old days of radio. Would I want that job again today, to go to a radio station to play records on the air and the tapes and the networks and all that goes with it? No, I wouldn't. We have technology. I could use a computer or two in a nice small control room, and I could do identically the same thing with a lot less mistakes, a lot less issues, a lot less problems, and a better audio quality overall. So the technology can be a useful tool as it's improved over the decades. When radio started in the 1920s, the audio quality was not that great. It got better by the 1930s and 40s and really improved in the 50s and 60s. And then with FM, of course, and FM stereo, it's been an onward, forward-moving medium in terms of quality. And radio has changed. We've talked about this before, too. If you go back to the 1920s and early 30s when the first stations were going on the air and the first networks were being developed, radio is essentially your overall general medium for everything. I mean, you had drama, you had comedy, you had music and variety. That's what radio was, kind of what TV became later. And when television came along, people predicted that radio would just be dead and gone. But they were wrong. Radio just reinvented what it did. Instead of trying to be what television became, it found a new way to do business and started playing music in specialized formats and even news, and became a companion. I can remember one of the old jingles we played at a radio station, take a lively companion wherever you go, take a portable radio. I mean, radio is a different kind of a medium. And once again, we're facing some changes because of the technology. Now, some of radio has hurt itself in the process and made the idea of online radio and satellite radio, a viable option for many people. And I'm going to tell you, including myself, most of the local AM and FM radio stations where I live in Florida are basically terrible. I mean, they are just awful. There's not a one that I care to listen to. They have done the automation route. They have just stripped the heart and soul out of it. They're weak in terms of their presentation, or they're too giggly in the morning and too silly to be taken seriously. And the major companies that bought up most of the radio stations have pretty well made radio for me in where I live in the east coast of Florida a horrible experience. So I will tell you right now, I do not listen to any local radio when I'm in Florida because the radio stations are that bad. They stink. They're awful. They have no personality. And it's not because I'm some old codger. It's just that they're playing the same records or the same recordings, the same songs, just a handful, and they beat them to death over and over again with the same silly presentation. Even when I'm in Georgia, it's not a whole lot better. there are only a few places I get a chance to visit from time to time where I actually have enjoyed listening to some of the radio that's on the air. And I'll be honest, I listen now to, we have satellite radio in our car. It's just easier. I don't want to sit there. Yeah, I know I can get online radio through my phone, and it plays beautifully through my system. It links by Bluetooth. I understand the technology. And I just don't have the time to worry about it. I just like to be able to get in the car, push a button, and go, because I don't want to sit there for 10 minutes looking for something to play in the air. And I listen to satellite radio. The audio quality is not great, but at least there's a higher variety in content, which local radio today is lacking. I hate that I have to pay a few dollars a month per vehicle to enjoy the privilege, but honestly, radio has come to the point in many places, not everywhere. There's some great local radio stations that really work hard to serve their community. I know we're on a couple of them with this program. They really make the effort to serve their community. And they're the ones that are becoming the rarity, not the majority. And so I listen now more to satellite. And I hate to admit it, after all those years and the fact that I'm still in the radio business, it's becoming increasingly hard to stomach what I hear the radio industry becoming. I've thought about getting involved in having another radio station, but frankly, at my age, I'm not sure if I will. I might. I'm looking at a possibility, depending if a couple of things happen at the FCC. I might consider doing one. It wouldn't be in Florida because, well, there's just no frequencies here, but I think I know a couple of places where there might be. And provide some alternative programming. Yeah, I would have to rely on automation, but I want to provide something different, something refreshing, something positive, something encouraging. And that's in the back of my mind. So that is the state of domestic radio in the United States. Now let's turn for a moment now to international shortwave and maybe its future. And what is its future? Once again, there's no doubt that over time, in the conventional AM and FM business, a lot of stations in Europe and Asia will go to the DAB plus type of transmission and move to digital. In the United States, we have the terrible system for digital, which I wish they had never adopted. That's just me, but it is what it is. They have it. I've got it in my car, and I'm not impressed at all with what we call HD radio in the United States. In fact, I find some of the analog carriers sound better than some of the digital that they put out, but maybe that's just me. But more channels of the same nothingness doesn't impress me. It's wonderful that the digital option is going to be there, perhaps for shortwave. And this program has a home still on international shortwave. And I think, honestly, the vast majority of those who listen to your weekend show listen internationally on shortwave from WRMI or the Voice of Hope. And that's why I really want you that are listening via shortwave to pay attention for a moment. I really need to hear that you're listening to this broadcast because I want to make sure that it's worth the time and effort to do. To share from my heart to yours the thoughts that are on my mind. You know, the Voice of Hope out of Africa has been a wonderful asset to cover that virtually the entire continent and even into the Middle East. And to be on WRMI gets me into a good chunk of North America, Canada, and Europe. And we do hear from people all over. And this would be one of those times I would love for you to go to the website if you have internet access to check out yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com, and let me know that you do listen to this program. It really helps me to know and gauge if I'm doing the job that needs to be done. Once again, that is yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com. Of course, Facebook, just search for Your Weekend Show. You can find us there. Radio is truly changing. International radio is changing. Many governments don't see a great future. Not that governments do the smartest things, let's be honest. But many are beginning to pull away from international shortwave and dumping all their eggs into the internet basket. Why do we need to operate a big transmitter and antenna field when we can just put it on the internet? That's the wave of the future, and in many ways it is. I mean, I'm not against internet radio. To be honest, if you hadn't, some of you already know, I operate an internet radio station that is online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it has a growing audience. Now, what am I doing with that particular station? I'm playing music you probably wouldn't find anywhere else. If you're looking for the traditional, many, many years old music and hymns of the church, you're going to find it at my online radio station, which is ancientwordradio.com. That is ancientwordradio.com. And at Ancient Word Radio, I'm working hard on the music library that's there. It's growing. Some songs are being added. A few are coming off that don't exactly fit. And we're looking to even add some programs that'll enhance the mission of this station. And see, the funny thing is, it's one of those kind of formats that unless you're in a huge city with a large potential audience, you're not going to get enough people to listen on a regular basis to sustain it. If I was in a small town, I used to live in a place called Toccoa, Georgia. Beautiful town of about 8,000 or 10,000 people in a county of 20,000. And if I were to own a little radio station, whether it's commercial, non-commercial, AM or FM, let's just assume a little FM with a couple of thousand watts to cover my town. And if I ran this format, I would have listeners, but not enough to financially justify its operation. I mean, there are music licensing fees, there's electricity, there's insurance, there's tower lease if you don't own it. I mean, the expenses go on, and all the maintenance of the equipment. And so a format like that, we learned the term way back in college called narrowcasting. In other words, you're looking for a small, specialized niche audience. You can only pull that off in big markets. It's rare you can ever get away with it in a small market. And that's where being on the internet has been a great advantage in producing this kind of a radio station. The entire world that has internet access is my potential audience. Now, I understand in many parts of the world, internet access is spotty, expensive, and sometimes non-existent. And even if it is existent in some countries, locations, and places in the world, the content, including something like Ancient Word Radio, would be restricted and forbidden content you would never find. But with that said, we have North America, most of Western Europe that can hear, and they listen. I look at the stats. I remember when we started this project a couple of years ago, to have just a handful of listeners was a big deal. And then as it started to get into a couple of hundred listeners, I was ecstatic, and it continues to grow. And I haven't promoted it that heavily because there's still some work to be done to make the station everything that I believe it truly can be. So I do see a future in internet radio, but it's not going to, as some people think, totally replace the concept of over-the-air radio. I mean, people say, well, what about 5G and all this? It's going to replace this. I listen to some of the silliest, stupidest, dumbest things coming out of the mouths of so-called experts, even those that are, on radio and the internet themselves. I listened to one guy, and if any of you are a ham operator or technical, you'll understand what I'm saying and probably get a good laugh. This one guy said FM radio is going to go away, and all the spectrum space for FM is going to go to Wi-Fi. And I'm thinking to myself, who told you that, and where did you find it? the entire FM band is not big enough for one Wi-Fi channel, and the characteristics of VHF are not conducive for spread spectrum. But people will say stupid things because they believe in themselves. They tell themselves they're experts, and they don't know as much as they think. And so when I see these people get on radio in particular and maybe internet television thinking they know everything about the end of the world, the end of times, we've had that discussion about the fakes and the phonies. I really don't have time for people that really are in it for the money for themselves. And so I don't get into the fake technology of some of the things that these people are trying to sell you. I just don't have the time. But the world is changing, and the younger generation, those that are teenagers today and in their early 20s and even into their 30s, they're using things like Spotify, Pandora, and other sources to get their music and entertainment. Those that want to have their own music library use things like iTunes or Google Tunes or whatever to get their music. And they live in their own music world, and they are detaching themselves from the increasingly lousy radio we find on the radio dial. So it's not so much that the internet is taking over radio, it's that radio station operators have done a bad job. They're chasing their own audience away. Let me say that again. Too many radio operators are doing such a bad job in programming their radio stations, they're chasing their audience away. And they're finding satellite radio and the internet a viable alternative. You didn't lose them because the technology is so much better, because frankly, I've listened to a lot of internet radio, and the audio quality is not all that impressive when you can only have so many kilobits of data going through. It doesn't sound that good. MP3 files are not that great. They are what they are. But people will gravitate to where the content they want to hear is. If a shortwave radio station is providing viable content to a target area of the world that has radio receivers, that shortwave facility will survive. And truthfully, if some of the domestic radio stations on even the AM dial, let alone the FM dial, had credible content, they'd be doing better than they are today. I don't care what anybody says. If your content is narrow, limited, and predictable, and cookie cutter, and repetitive, with no variety, and poorly executed, people don't listen. I know of a radio station in the northern part of Florida that I went to visit not long ago. They have some technical issues, and they asked me to take a look because I do have a technical background. And I listened to what they were playing on the air. They were automating an oldies format. And I love the idea of an oldies format personally because, hey, remember, I was a disc jockey that loved music from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and that's what they play. But his playlist was so small compared to the music that was actually out there. The technical quality was not great. And the thing was devoid of any personality, energy, or, any reason to listen beyond the tunes themselves. For a radio station in the town that it was in, I would have expected some personality, even through automation, to make me feel that somebody on the other side was talking to me as I'm driving around their community or living there. Now, shortwave's a little different. It's not that easy because of the way things are to, quote, have live radio announcers in many shortwave stations. A lot of them really can't get studios where they're at. And so a lot of the programming by necessity is recorded, like this program is. Though I know there are ways of doing it, and maybe some stations, even some of the ones that I'm on, should consider, doing some other things to provide some additional content. And I also understand the fact that you got to pay the bills because the power bill is not free. And there is no check from the United States government to subsidize the operation. So you can tell a shortwave station what you want to hear, but if there's no one to pay for it, you may not be hearing it, becomes part of the problem. But I also understand that a lot of shortwave operators need to strike a better balance in what they're doing. That's just my personal opinion. I understand what it means to pay the bills. I used to own a radio station, so I know. And what I'm saying is that content is king, not so much the platform. The funny thing is, Marshall McClure, back in the 1960s, he was a professor in Toronto, Canada, and he had this great line that the medium is the message. It's not so much that it's AM or FM or shortwave or online or whatever the case may be. It is the message, and the content becomes the king. What is the content that makes up that media? That's what's going to be attracting an audience. People don't put on music they hate and listen by the hour because they feel that they have to. And, I used to tell somebody in helping program a Christian radio station in Georgia many years ago, they would say, we need to provide the things the listeners need. Well, that's a good, wonderful thing to think and believe, but if you are applying that concept in a way to chase audience away, then the things that the audience you believe should be there need to hear will never hear it. If nobody likes the music you're playing, then nobody's going to hear the commercial that you played to keep the radio station viable and on the air. Now think about that for a second. If nobody's listening to what you are playing, then the commercial you play is ineffective, and after a while, the guy paying for the commercial will not continue to pay for that commercial, and he will cancel. And a lot of programmers in a lot of small markets don't seem to understand the importance of the quality of their content and delivering with a purpose, what they're doing on the radio. Now, for me, radio, I see, is going to be going through a lot of changes over the next years. AM, FM in this country will go through severe changes, and I think many of the AM radio stations, because they've allowed their technical facilities to decline, will simply go off the air, shut down, and go out of business. A number of FMs, a few of them, will follow suit because of their lack of doing anything creative in their programming, and they will wonder why nobody is listening, and they'll just blame the internet, when the truth is they only have themselves to blame because the quality of the internet radio stream is not as good as the FM. I don't care what anybody says. It's not as good. It may sound like, oh, yeah, it's digital, it's got to be better. What people are flocking to online is the content, not so much the way it gets there. Yeah, it's easier to listen to it on your phone, but had radio stations done the job they should have done 10, 15 years ago to keep an audience stable, they could have very easily launched their own apps, and some of them have done it. It's funny, you could have a radio station and also be online and you're still not doing well because it's your content that is your issue. Well, for whatever reason, I have ranted and raved for the longest time. I don't think I've ever done this in all the 4 going on 5 years now, in our 5th year of doing this radio show. But radio is a business that I have a very strong passion about. I really do. I still do. I believe in AM and FM radio properly done. I believe there is still a usefulness for shortwave, though a lot of what I hear on the shortwave dial is just paid-for junk and bad theology, crazy people. Sorry, but that's just my personal opinion, some of the things that I hear. But the bottom line is this: content is king. And I hope that in my years ahead to be able to provide content to AM, FM, and even shortwave stations that is diverse, different, engaging, educational, and fun to listen to. We need more of that in all the forms of media, or we're going to end up with nothing but a sterile-sounding Spotify or Pandora that is wiped clean the radio spectrum because the radio industry committed suicide to themselves. Radio survived television. Radio has survived format changes and changes in attitudes. it can survive if it looks to provide something that is wanted and desired and not throw out mediocrity onto the air. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann.
What goes up must come down. Spinning wheel, got to go round. Talking about your troubles, it's a crying sin. Ride a painted pony, let the spinning wheel spin. You got no money and you got no home. Spinning wheel, all alone. Talking about your troubles and you never learn. Ride a painted pony, let the spinning wheel turn. Did you find the directing sign on the straight and narrow highway? Would you mind the reflecting sign? Just let it shine within your mind and show you the colors that are real. Someone is waiting just for you. Spinning wheel, spinning true. Drop all your troubles by the riverside. Catch a painted pony on the spinning wheel ride. What goes up must come down. Spinning wheel, got to go round. Talking about your troubles, it's a crying sin. Ride a painted pony, let the spinning wheel spin. You got no money and you got no home. Spinning wheel, all alone. Talking about your troubles and you never learn. Ride a painted pony, let the spinning wheel turn. Did you find the directing sign on the straight and narrow highway? Would you mind the reflecting sign? Just let it shine within your mind and show you the colors that are real. Someone is waiting just for you. Spinning wheel, spinning true. Drop all your troubles by the riverside. Catch a painted pony on the spinning wheel ride.
And welcome back to your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Haven't heard that song in a long time. Spinning Wheel here on your weekend show. I realized I started the program thinking I would talk for just a few minutes about the radio business, and it turned out to be, well, just a lot to say. There's a lot of things I still love about radio, a lot of things that I don't, and I'm not happy with, as you heard. And I want to see what I can do to help make radio better than it's been. I'm trying to provide with Ancient Word Radio, for example, an alternative, and I'll share a couple of things from Ancient Word Radio in just a few minutes before I close the program. It's a project laid on my heart. Now, I understand that for many of you listening, it's not going to be your kind of music, your kind of station. But then again, that's the good thing about Internet radio. It does cover a large portion of the world. A matter of fact, as I looked the other day at the statistics on where people are living, I initially thought that my biggest audience was probably in the United States. Well, why not? That's what you would think, but I was pleasantly surprised that it's all over the world. There is a large number in the United States and Canada, but a significant number in the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, just to name some of the countries. A number of countries in the old Eastern European bloc surprised me as well. And it's not that they listen for a few minutes. They listen for an hour to an hour and a half at a clip. I'm seeing some listening in places I would never expect. Of course, in other places that would make sense, like Australia, there are those that are listening. Switzerland and Sweden, I was surprised. Germany definitely is a place with the format I have would be fitting. Ireland and Scotland, all part of the UK, and even in a few areas on the continent of Africa, particularly in South Africa. So when you have the potential of billions of people with Internet access, it makes getting a few thousand listeners possible for a very narrow format. And thus, as little as it costs to operate Ancient Word Radio, it becomes sustainable. And that's where a format like what I put together would probably not work well in conventional radio unless you're in a big city like New York or a Dallas, Chicago. It might work there to find enough listeners to make it worth the effort. So I hope that you'll take a little time to check out the project at ancientwordradio.com. That's ancientwordradio.com. If you like what you hear, and if you have an Android phone, there's a free app. And no, we don't snoop around your phone for anything. Only thing we want to know is where you listen from. That's about it. We don't care about you and your personal data. So you can safely put on the app. We don't collect any of that stuff. And we hope that you'll take the time to visit you can visit ancientwordradio.com. That's ancientwordradio.com. We're thinking about putting together a program about Ancient Word Radio with music to maybe operate on an air on a station like a WRMI or maybe even for the Voice of Hope or some other facility to introduce people to the format. And I may do that in the next couple of weeks, just spend a little bit of the time of the program sharing some of the music. I might even do that before the end of today's program and some of the things that we're putting on the air. I've got a good friend of mine up in Asheville, North Carolina. He's in the ministry, and he produces a radio program, and he'll be actually adding his program onto Ancient Word Radio. It's called Faith Seeking Understanding, and I've really enjoyed listening to the material, and I'm excited about having it on Ancient Word Radio. It is mostly a station with music, and most of the talk is short and brief with the exception of a few programs here and there. The vast majority is very traditional choral and historic music of the church. And if you like that kind of thing, I would hope that you'll check out ancientwordradio.com. That is ancientwordradio.com. If you've listened to today's program and have some thoughts and comments about what you've heard, if you've stuck with me all this time, why not visit our website as well for the radio show? That is yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. Yourweekendshow.com. You can send me an email from there, your thoughts, suggestions, and hear other prior episodes as well. And like I say, we're talking about the Ancient Word Radio concept. It came to me a few years ago, the idea when I was looking around for some very traditional music. Sometimes when I'm reading or meditating or just relaxing, I get tired of the same old you hear on radio, And most internet radio stations that I'm finding are just playing the same 100 or 200 songs everybody else is. It's hard to find with so many thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of stations out there. It's hard to find what you're looking for. It really is. And but I'm thankful for those that have found Ancient Word Radio, and I'm hearing back that those that have found it like it and listen quite often, and some are now using the app. It's a growing project that I thought about a couple of years ago, and it lay dormant. I didn't do much with it. I kind of ran it, but my time was so consumed at that point, I really never developed it. In the last several months, I've gotten more serious with it. And since that time, I've watched it suddenly out of nowhere grow each and every week. And I hope that maybe you'll take the opportunity to listen and let me know what you think about Ancient Word Radio. To give you an idea of what Ancient Word Radio has, I'm going to just play you a song or two that you would find on the Ancient Word Radio app and also at the website. Well, there you have a little sample of the kind of music you'll find at Ancient Word Radio. I will tell you that there is quite a variety of music. That's not the only style. There's a lot of choral music, a lot of old hymns and anthems, some instrumental solo. Even some of the newer music is also found that kind of fits what we're trying to do within the concept of ancient word radio. So there is quite a variety you can find at ancientwordradio.com. With an Android phone, there's also a free app available at the Google Play Store. Just put in Ancient Word Radio and you'll find it. And we would be interested to know what you think of this little project. We've talked a lot about radio today and its future, its past, its present. Radio's been through a lot of changes, and it will continue, like anything else in this world, to go through some changes. But I want to close the program here in these last minutes with just a few thoughts. There's something that I read a long time ago, and it comes out of the Bible. It talks about in those final days, there'll be such an increase in knowledge. Ever heard that? There'll be this marvelous increase in knowledge. But the one thing that I have observed is that the more we increase in knowledge, now think about this for a second, there seems to be a corresponding decrease in wisdom. Let me repeat that if you didn't hear it. I am beginning to really see, especially in the United States, Canada, the Western world in particular, the more we increase in knowledge, the more we decrease in wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to take knowledge for a good, noble, and useful purpose. We have so much technology at our hands. I look at the new cell phone I just got myself a couple of weeks ago. I had a problem with the other one, didn't feel like getting one, but I ended up having to do it anyway. And I marvel at all the things that this pocket-sized device can do. Compared to the ones from 5 years ago and 10 years ago, we've come a long way. And to watch how computers and technology have marched forward each and every year. I remember the first computers I was dealing with in the 1980s, all DOS-based, very limited. And I look at this phone that fits in the palm of my hand, and it has more computing power than all the computers that landed man on the moon and brought him back home. We have increased in knowledge. Look at the cell phone. It's a classic example of our increase in knowledge. We're looking at 5G, which will give us unprecedented speed. Not that I think it's going to cover a whole lot more territory, but increased speed on these devices in our hands. Yet what do we often use these devices in our hands for? Getting in social media situations where we just get angry at each other. That's not wisdom. We have the increase in knowledge, the increase in what we think is anonymity online, but we really don't. We live in a different world today than we did when I was coming along, but the condition of man hasn't changed. And until then, we can increase in knowledge all we want, while we seriously neglect in having any respectable wisdom. You know, the fear of God is the beginning of understanding and wisdom. I use technology as a tool. I don't let technology define who I am. We've run out of time. Don't forget yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. Until next week at this same time, may God richly bless you.